Okay, good evening friends. I'm very glad that you could make it here and ahead of me to hear this address tonight. And to anybody who may see this later and hear it via YouTube, welcome. I do think that tonight's subject is an important subject. It's a subject that I've done quite a bit of research on over the years. I've called it Undesigned Coincidences. In a way, that's not a good title, but what we're looking for is marks of truth within the Bible record itself, so that it will tell us that the record that's there is reliable, that it's dependable, and therefore it's authoritative. So tonight we're not going to consider other things like archaeology. Archaeology is a subject in its own right, and the testimony that archaeology bears to the Bible. Some of the things I say tonight may just impinge upon archaeology, but that's not the point. What we're going to do tonight is to look at the Bible record itself and alone to see whether there are indications within it that it is a reliable record of truth. That's what we're going to do. So we're also not going to look at external historical records. That too is another subject that's very worthwhile. But we're ignoring all those things. We're just concentrating on the record that we have before us, and we're examining it like within a court of law. So what I'm intending to do tonight is to cover 6 examples. Now I have given an address on this previously, but tonight it will be a representation of quite a bit of material I've done before with 2 new examples. I especially want to concentrate on the Old Testament, because the Old Testament is the area of the Bible in particular that people think is mythological. So all these characters that are recorded there, they're just inventions. If there was any historical character, the record about them has been hugely embellished, and we don't need to take any notice of it today. It's much like the stories of King Arthur or Robin Hood or something like that, but these are even earlier, so they're even less significant. So I want to look tonight at 3 examples out of many from the Old Testament. They're listed there, and then 3 from the New Testament if we get the time, and a conclusion to wrap it all up. Okay, so first of all I want to acknowledge my source of information in this. I have read the Bible myself many times, cover to cover. I've been taught to take it as authoritative. So I have always read it carefully and been taught to study it. I am an amateur in all that, with very little proper theological qualification, but that doesn't really matter. I have read not only the Bible, but I've read about the Bible very widely. And amongst other things, I've read this book that's mentioned up here that I want to acknowledge. Undesigned Coincidences in the Writings both of the Old and New Testaments, an Argument for Their Veracity. Very long title, typical of the era in which it was written. It was written by a fellow called John James Blunt in 1833, and then revised and added to it in 1847, long time ago. So this subject has been around for quite a while, but it's sadly been greatly neglected, even in Christian and even evangelical conservative Christian circles. It's been neglected for a very long time. It's been partly resurrected by some in modern days, as I'll mention in a minute. But anyway, he wrote this book that I've read in its entirety. Here is a cover of one of the presentations of that book. And the arrangement of the book covers all the Bible in 5 sections: the books of Moses, historical scriptures of the Old Testament, prophetic scriptures of the Old Testament, the Gospel and Acts, and then there's an appendix covering the Gospels, Acts and Josephus. So he's in particular looking between this. It does go beyond the Bible, but the record of Josephus, which was from about New Testament times. And in this, Blunt, who is a professor, he was a professor of divinity at Cambridge in England and an Anglican priest. He lived in those years there. He found all these so-called coincidences in these different sections. Altogether, more than 133. That's quite significant. The point about this subject too is that it's a cumulative thing. If we look at one illustration, and you might think of that illustration, oh, that's not very powerful, it doesn't really speak to me, I can't see it, whatever. Don't worry, we move on to the next one, and the whole thing is cumulative. It's any one by itself might be not very significant, or it might be significant, but it adds to all the ones that follow to make up a whole argument for believing the truth of the Bible. Now, Blunt is not the only one. He actually followed someone else, a fellow called William Paley, who I think also was Anglican and highly educated, another very conservative evangelical scholar who looked in detail in particular at the Acts of the Apostles and the letters that are attributed to Paul in the New Testament. And he looked for correspondences between the two, how they meshed. Perhaps at this point I should explain what I mean by undesigned coincidences. What we're looking for, it's just like in a court of law where you hear testimony from one or more witnesses about something that is purported to have happened. Someone's accused of something or other, they might deny everything about it, but you listen to witnesses, and the judge or the jury are listening to these witnesses, and they're endeavouring to evaluate, is this witness telling the truth, or are they making things up? That's what this is all about. Is there something within their testimony that there's consistent telling of details in it, or is there something that pops out and tells you, oh, no, that doesn't add up. It's not true. Often these things will become apparent in incidental details in the testimony. Won't be the direct thing. They said, well, he did this. Won't be that. It'll be in all the things that are around that, in their telling of what they saw, what they allegedly witnessed, and then that's compared with what someone else said. Now, if two witnesses said exactly the same thing about something, what would you do? You'd suspect collusion. You'd expect that one had taken from the other, or vice versa, or that they got together and agreed what they would say. In a court of law, when people witness about what they've seen or heard, very often there is not total agreement about minute details, but there is a meshing of the details. One will bring out one fact, and another will bring out another fact altogether. And if those facts, all those alleged facts, they mesh and they agree with one another, there's a coincidence there, and then you can have confidence that those people are telling the truth about what they've seen. And the point about this too is that where you can test that a witness is reliable and you come to the conclusion that they are, well, that gives you confidence about the parts that you can't test, that there's no longer ability to test whether what they're saying is true. So this whole subject, I feel, is very important. As I said, it often comes out about incidental things in the record, not the prime thing itself. And another issue about this, another point about this kind of treatment is that it's not only that these the alleged facts that one presents and the other present all mesh and make a consistent story, but that often one thing that a person says will be explained by a fact that another person says, that will make it understandable, that will make it reasonable, or vice versa, so that they add together. The point is that the witness either of one person in all their different parts adds together consistently and harmoniously, or that between two witnesses about the same thing, they add together and coincide in that way. So that's what the subject is about, undesigned coincidence. It's undesigned in the sense that there's been no agreement between these two witnesses. Hey, you say this and I'll say that. Let's both say the same thing. No, both give independent testimony to something, and that independent testimony coincides. That's the coincidence we're talking about. So I hope that explains sufficiently what it is we're talking about. Now, yes, I was telling you about other books on this same subject, or other people who have treated the same thing. Blunt, in his very careful analysis of the whole Bible and finding these 133 coincidences, built upon the work of a previous scholar by the name of William Paley. He wrote a book called Horai Paulini. I could write it down, but anyway, it's Horai, H-O-R-A-E, Paulini, which is Latin, meaning the hours or the times of Paul. So he's looking at the writings of Paul, his letters that we have in the New Testament, and the writing of Acts, which we understand was written by Luke, a companion of Paul, and he's looking for these coincidences between the two, and he brings out heaps and heaps of them. Now, I've only read half his book. Both these books, Blunt's book and Paley's book, is a little difficult to read because of the era in which it was written, but the material in it is really good. In much more modern times, there's been another person who's written and spoken on the subject, and her name is Lydia McGrew, M-C-G-R-E-W. Now, unfortunately, I didn't bring her book along tonight, which Kevin's kindly lent me, but her book is on the same subject about coincidences, and she looks in particular at the New Testament as well, particularly the Gospels and Acts. And she draws a lot on the work of these previous scholars, but it's much more readable because she's a modern writer, and for that reason I find it easier to read. I've only read some of that book. I'm intending to read all of it. She has a few of her own, but mostly she draws upon others by Blunt and Paley. Her husband too, Timothy McGrew, I think both of them are PhDs, probably in theology. I think he's a philosopher as well, philosopher and theologian, have spoken on the subject. So if you explore through YouTube the subject, undesigned coincidences for the Bible, all those names, Lydia McGrew or her husband Tim McGrew, you'll find addresses by them both. There was also some printed material on the internet too that I have found on this subject.
You can download both books in their entirety.
Not the modern one. The modern one was only...
Not the modern one, but
yeah,
Blunt's book.
That's correct. Both of them are long out of print, so you can actually access them both on the internet, download the whole lot. I did that. I've actually got Blunt's book, but I've downloaded Paley's book. So anyway, that's the background to the subject. Now let's move on to one of the, I think we've talked about that, haven't we? We're limiting it to the Bible itself, and the whole question is this a truthful account? Can I rely on it? And this has great implications, because if it is a truthful record of real people, about real events, very often there's miracle mixed up in it. Well, that has implications. That miracle must have happened if we get a rely on the record that's written. And it then has implications for ourselves, because if this is what it purports to be, the Word of God, then it's authoritative to me in my life and to you. Okay, let's continue. So the first one I want to look at is right back in Genesis chapter 24, about Rebecca. Rebecca, one of the patriarchal characters. This is an absolutely beautiful story, and I commend Genesis 24 to be read in any case. It is a truly beautiful story. It's quite long, but it's about Abraham, and this is about nearly 4,000 years ago, according to Bible chronology. It's before there's much archaeological evidence. You can't find a statue of Abraham. You can't find Abraham's name, that Abraham anyway, written on a stone of that era about him, okay? So, and because of that, people say, oh, well, it's all mythical. Well, let's have a look at the record, see what we can learn from the record. So Genesis 24 is about Abraham late in life, and he wants his son to be married to somebody suitable. So he doesn't want him to be married to the local Canaanites who are all pagans. He wants him to be married into his own extended family way, way back in Mesopotamia, long way away. You know, in the modern equivalent, it would be like from here to, out of Mongolia or somewhere like that. Even it's actually more remote than that, because they were weeks and weeks away from any contact with that area. So anyway, he sends his trusted servant. Abraham's very wealthy. He sends his trusted servant out to go and find a wife for his son Isaac. He says, "Go back to where my people came from." So he goes, and this servant prays for God's guidance and blessing on his venture. So he sets out, he asks for a particular sign, and lo and behold, he comes across this lady at the well, and her name is Rebecca. It turns out that Rebecca is actually a relation of Abraham. And the story is very beautiful. It's beautiful because it shows the providence of God, about God answering prayer, about God providing for the continuation of his plan through Abraham and Abraham's son, all the way down eventually to Jesus Christ, and God's plan through Jesus for us all in the whole world. But it tells about Abraham sending the servant out. And the main characters in the story are, well, first of all, Abraham, and then this servant. And it covers a lot about the servant, about how he prays and what he encounters. Then about Rebecca, whom he encounters at the well. And then about Laban, who is the one who says whether Rebecca can go or not. And he's the one who does all the negotiation. He provides the hospitality for the servant and all the attendants with the servant, very wealthy, and they had a train of camels and lots of gifts and things. It was an intensely patriarchal society. And the amazing thing is, at the end of this, Rebecca goes off with these men whom she's only just met to go, 1,000,000 miles away to marry a man she's never met, this Isaac. And Isaac marries her. He says he's comforted after the death of his mother. He marries her and he loves her. I think that's very beautiful. It really, really moves me, that whole story, that in this arranged marriage, you see the courage, the trust of Rebecca in the leadership, in the leading of God. The whole thing is really wonderful. But anyway, all that is aside, we're wanting to look to see whether there are signs within the story. Now, I've already mentioned the major characters in the story. The father of Rebecca is a fellow called Bethuel. And Bethuel is mentioned a few times through this account. And instead of Bethuel taking a leading account in this story, Rebecca's brother Laban does. He's the one who goes out to meet the servants at the well after Rebecca's encountered them, who invites them back to the home. He says, yes, there's supplies for the camels, and stay here, and provides all the hospitality that Middle Eastern people would provide. He's the one that does all the negotiation with the servant. Here's his story about what has happened, why he thinks this is from God and everything. And he finally puts the question to Rebecca, will you go with this man? Rebecca agrees. So he takes the role, and it's the role of the father. And in fact, you could read the story a dozen times and not realise this, because Bethuel, the father, is such an insignificant character in the story. It's Laban who takes the expected role of the father, not Bethuel. Now, this is in stark contrast with a generation following, when Jacob flees the wrath of his brother Esau. This is the next generation down, the next patriarch. He's fearful that his brother's going to kill him, so he flees, and he goes all this way again, 1,000,000 miles away, off to his uncle Laban. And when he's with Laban, he falls in love with the beautiful Rachel, his daughter. Now, apart from the fact that Laban tricks Jacob into marrying his older daughter Leah first, and then the second one, Rachel, whom he wanted, apart from that trickery, Laban plays completely the part you'd expect of a Middle Eastern father of that era and of ever since, the one who's dominant, who's in control, who's the one who says yes, no, and the price is such and such, So Jacob has to deal with Laban at negotiating with him for the right to marry his daughter, and the price that will be, and so on. And the whole story, several chapters later on after Genesis 24, Laban plays the expected role of a father all through periods up to modern times, and especially in the Middle East. Now, Bethuel doesn't play that role in Genesis 24. You might even get to think, he's referred to a few times. I think I might have the quotations, yeah. It mentions in verse 15 that Rebecca was the daughter of Bethuel. So we know Bethuel's the father. And when she first encounters this servant of Abraham, she says, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son that Milcah bore to Nahor. So yes, she's the daughter of Bethuel. She acknowledges that. And then it tells us in verses 29 to 31, Rebecca had this brother Laban, and he hurried out to the man at the spring. As soon as he'd seen the nose ring, because this servant had given some gifts to Rebecca, and the bracelets on her sister's arms, he heard Rebecca tell what the man said to her. He went out to the man, found him standing by the camels near the spring. Come, you who are blessed by the Lord, he said. Why are you standing out here? I've prepared the house and a place for the camels. It was he took the initiative about providing hospitality and a place to stay. And then later on it tells the servant, they're sitting down to have this, what was probably an elaborate feast. And the servant says, I will not eat till I've told you what I've come for, why I'm here. Then tell us. Laban said, not Bethuel, Laban. And as the story goes on, you almost might think that Bethuel's not there. He's acknowledged as the father of the bride-to-be, but that's all. However, he is there. And at one point, it says, whoops, woo, 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 woo. At one point in the story, it says, Laban and Bethuel answered. This is from the Lord. We can say nothing to you one way or the other. In other words, yes, they're acknowledging that all that's happened is from the Lord and that it seems appropriate that Rebecca go off and marry this Isaac. That's the only case in this whole chapter where Bethuel is mentioned as doing something, and he doesn't do it alone. He does it with his son, presumably the oldest son, Rebecca's brother. And then the servant, that's the servant of Abraham, at the end of all this negotiation, he brings out gifts. And he gives gold and silver jewellery and articles of clothing. Abraham was very wealthy. And he gave them to Rebecca. He also gave costly gifts to her brother and to her mother. Who's missing from that? Bethuel the father. Strange, isn't it? And then later on in the chapter, a few verses further on, her brother and her mother replied, let the young woman remain with us 10 days or so, then you may go. And then later on they decide, then they said, let's call the young woman and ask her about it. Finally, this is a concession to, the rights of the woman. Well, we'll ask her, what she thinks. So they did. They called her in. They called Rebecca and asked her. And then she said, yes, I will go. So they sent their sister Rebecca on her way. See, it says their sister, not his daughter. Their sister Rebecca on her way, along with her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebecca and said to her, our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands, a blessing of that day for her marriage and future. And in another chapter, this is quite a long way further on, when we come to the next story, Jacob said to people he encountered, do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson? Now all these verses add together. They're giving a consistent testimony about the insignificance of Bethuel. He is actually there, but he takes no role. Now this is quite very strange in one way, because it's so different from the story in the following generations I've mentioned, and it's so different from what you'd expect. Now had this been a fiction, had this been somebody making the story up, don't you think they would have had a regular Middle Eastern father in this? That Bethuel, the father of Rebecca, would have done all the negotiation, the hospitality, and he would have been the one who'd have to be appeased and gifts presented to him, etc. That would be normal and what you'd expect, but it's not there. However, nothing is brought out in the record to explain why it's not like that. That is a mark of somebody telling the truth. Because if it was fictitious, either they would have had Bethuel as being a regular Middle Eastern father of that era, or if they'd thought of let's have something really unusual here, don't you think they would have explained it? And we don't know why it's like that. We can surmise Bethuel was incapacitated in some way. Maybe he was senile. Maybe he'd had an accident and hit his head or whatever. Who knows? It's not explained in the record. And that really is a mark, a demonstration that what is here is a truthful recording of the facts of the case. And that means that the characters recorded are real characters. The event that's recorded is a real event. This is a very long time ago, way before you can get corroboration with historical records and archaeology and so on. Well, I think that's very powerful, actually. And that's my first example. And there's Rebecca travelling off to Isaac. As I say, it is a very beautiful story, and quite apart from its significance in the way I've demonstrated. Okay, let's move on. The second story, again, I want to emphasise the Old Testament. We go on further in the books of Moses, and this concerns the Exodus from Egypt. Another event that people like to say, oh, well, that's all just Jewish myths, and it's the way they explain how they came to be, a bit like Australian Aboriginal legends about the landscape and everything. Never really happened. It's just all, you read it if you want to, but that's it. Okay, now during this exodus from Egypt, they escaped as slaves under Moses' leadership. They were going through the wilderness, and there was a rebellion. There was a very significant rebellion in that time. And the rebellion was by three fellows called Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And here's some illustrations of what happened. They rebelled against Moses' authority, and God demonstrated Moses' right to lead the people and his anger with these people by actually opening up the earth and them all being swallowed up. So the Bible records in Numbers chapter 16. Now, this is from Blunt as well. Now, Korah was one of the priests. He was from the tribe of Levi, who were priests. And the tribe of Levi had three main branches in it, three main clans. He was from the family of Kohath in that. And Dathan and Abiram were actually brothers of the tribe of Reuben. You can get all this from Numbers chapter 16, and they led this great exodus. Now, the coincidence about all this is that when you look in another part of the Old Testament, this is in a different book even, in Numbers chapter 2 and chapter 3, we find that they happen to live in adjacent parts of the camp. Now, let me just explain the significance of that. The way that they were arranged in the wilderness was not all haphazard. They were very orderly. And they built and kept a tabernacle within the very centre, that's the place of worship, in the centre of their camp. And this diagram sort of represents how they were arranged. There were tribes arranged around the camp. There were 3 tribes on one side, 3 tribes on another, and another, because there were 12 tribes of Israel. Actually, one of the tribes became the priestly tribe, and another tribe, Joseph, because of he was the one through whom they'd been saved in Egypt, he became 2 tribes. So the 12 tribes were maintained with the additional tribe of Levi. Now, Levi were the priests, and they were put close by the tabernacle around on 3 sides here. This is the entrance to the tabernacle, just the single entrance to the curtain all the way around it. And this is a bit like the temple, but it was a mobile temple that God instructed them to build for his worship in the wilderness. You've got these 3 sides, and they were the 3 families or clans of Levi. So represented here, you can see more clearly the 3 on each side, like so, and the 3. This is all defined in the text. It tells you where they were to camp and so on. And what we do find is that Kohath here is right adjacent to Reuben, the tribe from which the other 2 came. And yet where this is explained in a different book, a different section of the books of Moses, it's got nothing to do with the rebellion. This is just telling you how they were to be organised. God gave them these instructions. You shall set up your tents here and here and here, so on. Now, it just so happens that they're right adjacent. And this gives some plausibility to the fact that it was these 3, 2 from this tribe, together, 2 brothers who probably had their tents right next to one another, and they were leaders in this tribe. and somebody from Kohath. They got together and over time worked out this strategy and why they didn't think Moses was any good and why he should be replaced, etc. So this is in a completely different part, but it gives some plausibility to the fact that these three were the core of the rebellion. Now, what we are told that, without going into the whole story, and I'm not seeking here to get into justification for God doing what he did, judging them in this way, and all their descendants, it does say that the earth opened up and they were swallowed. Everything belonging to Dathan and Abiram perished, as did Korah, and that's recorded in this part of Numbers here. Now, when we look at the text, I've just simply listed there on that page the relevant text, where the camp of Reuben was. They're on the south side, and the Kohathite clans were to camp on the south side too. And then it says how Moses got up, went to Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed him. He warned them, get back from the tents of these wicked men who've been about this rebellion. God's going to judge them. Don't touch anything belonging to them, or you'll be swept away because of all their sins. So they moved away from the tents of Korah, Dathan and Abiram. Dathan and Abiram had come out and were standing with their wives, children and little ones at the entrance of their tents. And then a bit further on it says, as soon as he'd finished saying all of this, and Moses being the mouthpiece of God, the ground under them split apart, the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them and their households and all those associated with Korah, together with their possessions. They went down alive into the realm of the dead with everything they owned. The earth closed over them, they perished and were gone from the community. At their cries, all the Israelites around them fled, shouting, the earth is going to swallow us too. Now this sounds incredible that it would happen, and I appreciate it raises questions about the severity of God in this, and whether it's just that their little ones were involved in the judgment. Let's leave all that aside. We're just trying to gauge whether this record is believable or not. Now, later on, this is in a much further section of Numbers. It says that Dathan and Abiram were the community officials who rebelled against Moses and Aaron and were among Korah's followers when they rebelled against the Lord. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them along with Korah, whose followers died when the fire devoured the 250 men. They served as a warning sign. The line of Korah, however, did not die out. Now it might seem on first reading of that those three men, their wives and all their families all went, so that was the end of their line. And it was for Dathan and Abiram, but on careful reading of the text you see that it wasn't so with Korah. Korah died, it says. It definitely says that Korah went down, but not his family. And much later in the Bible, in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles chapter 6 and 11 of the Psalms have got a record that these Psalms were written and music for them too, composed by the sons or descendants of Korah. So Korah's line actually continued, and when you carefully read the text, you'll see that they probably were by the tents of the other two, Dathan and Abiram, with their families. Korah and other followers, other participants in this rebellion were there too. They all disappeared, but actually Korah's family continued. Now I think that what this shows is that when you look at, first of all, there are separate parts of the record that indicate the plausibility of the rebellion being amongst those three, and it didn't say someone who was situated remotely from them, but they were actually contiguous in the camp. And the second thing is that to get a picture of what fully happened, you need to carefully read the text. That it is actually consistent, the story fully of what happened, and needs several parts of the Bible to be brought together in that. Okay, I can't say more about that now. Let's just move on to one more again from the Old Testament. Now we're moving on to the historical scriptures, which are the time of Joshua. This is after Moses. The first 5 books of Moses were past that. We're now into Joshua. Now here, the book of Joshua tells of their entry into the promised land. It tells of what happened at Jericho, how the walls collapsed and they took Jericho, how they took Ai, how they had an encounter with the Gibeonites, how they were deceived by the Gibeonites into making a treaty with them, and so on. And then the book of Joshua goes on in about chapter, chapter 10. It talks about the campaigns that Joshua undertook to take the whole promised land as God had given them. Now once again, I don't want to get into here the issue of whether that was justified or not, the conquest of Canaan. That is a worthwhile subject for another occasion, and I think it has been dealt with or will be dealt with in the program next year. But the point here is I want to look at seeing whether there's something in this record that gives us reason to believe what happened. Is it just a fiction that they came in and, oh yeah, he fought this lot and this lot and this lot and they took the land? Is that where Israel really came from to be in that land, displacing other people, or is it all just made up? Okay, now there's a particular city there called Lachish, and in the record in Joshua chapter 10 it tells, after these previous events, how Joshua led a campaign. He led 2 campaigns actually, one down south and one up north, to take the whole of the land of Canaan after the crossing of Jordan and the fall of Jericho. Now there's 6 towns mentioned in Joshua chapter 10. You can look at this at your leisure. That they came on this town, and in those days there was a king of the town, very low-level king, not like great kings or emperors of later times. There's a king of this town, and this king of this town, and that town. They were all sort of fortified cities, and so on. Anyway, Joshua 10, from verses 28 to 43, tells how Joshua led this campaign. They went from one town to another, and of 6 towns, it says they were all taken the same day that they arrived there. That's pretty amazing. So they all troop, the soldiers troop up, surround the walls, and they managed to take that city in that same day and deal with them. So I'm not going to get into, what they did or anything. They conquered it, okay? But then of Lachish, it's the only one of these 6 that it says it was taken on the 2nd day. Now this is so incidental in the record, it wouldn't matter if it wasn't there, because he's just saying, well, he went to this place and took it, went to that place, took it, so went to that, and therefore he took that whole area and that God had promised them, and they had it. And just incidentally it says that Lachish was taken on the 2nd day. It's the only one that says it of that. And that's in verse 32 of Joshua chapter 10. You might think, well, so what? That's so incidental. Now later on, when, completely unconnected with Joshua, hundreds of years later, in fact, there are 2 records in the time of Sennacherib, who came against Jerusalem. This is about 800 years later. And it tells how Sennacherib, with his powerful Assyrian army, came against the land, besieged Jerusalem, surrounded it, it looked like Jerusalem was going to fall. And he took all the cities of Judah around and everything, and all of Israel, and they all went off into captivity and so on. But it says that it says in particular in 2 Chronicles 32 and 2 Kings 18, that Lachish was a strong city and he couldn't take that. So Lachish survived and Jerusalem survived. Lachish was one of the few other cities than Jerusalem that survived the onslaught of Sennacherib before he returned ignominiously back to Assyria and didn't ever take Jerusalem. Later on, how much later? This is 100 years later. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, came against the land. Israel had already fallen, but the kingdom of Judah was there with its capital Jerusalem. And again, in Jeremiah 34, it says he had difficulty, he succeeded, but he had difficulty taking Lachish. Now both these passages indicate that Lachish was strongly defended. It was in a good position naturally with its fortification to withstand attack, and so it couldn't easily be taken by Sennacherib or Nebuchadnezzar. And so that in a completely different part of the record, tells you something about Lachish back at the time of Joshua, that it was a better defended city in a better position than the other 5 towns that Joshua came against. Now again, there's no collusion here at all. One's not trying to explain the other at all, but they fit together. They fit together. One gives you a reason to understand the other. Okay, that's the point of an undesigned coincidence. So you might think, oh, that's trivial, that's incidental. Yes, it is incidental to the record, but it's just an indication that what is written here is actually a true record. And if you can find reason to believe it's truth in one place, then other places that you can't test it, you can have confidence in it there too. Okay? Now, moving. Okay, look, there's all the quotes. If you get to see this on the YouTube, you can go through these at your leisure. It's telling you what I've just really recounted to you about how Joshua took these particular cities, but Lachish alone was taken on the second day, whereas all the others were taken the very day that they came to them. And here's the references about Sennacherib and how he withdrew from Lachish. And the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, about what he did. And the Lachish held out, Lachish and Azekah held out for longer than the rest. Okay? Now let's turn to the New Testament and we'll cover a few here. Now this is one I particularly like from one illustration I like from the New Testament. Jesus heals many. Okay, now we know that Jesus' whole ministry was a combination of his healing work to people, which was a sign that God was with him and authenticating his teaching and his mission, and then his teaching as well. They go together all the way through. Now, when we read in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 8, verse 16, we read that when evening came, many people came to Jesus seeking healing. I think, well, there's nothing wonderful about that. Even before that, in Matthew's Gospel, there's many records of Jesus healing. He'd gone through the region of Galilee and into Syria, and crowds had followed him here and there, bringing their lame, their sick, their demented, everything to him, the blind, for healing. And Jesus healed many of them. And he developed a huge following in this way. That coupled with his teaching in the synagogue and elsewhere, the two went together, like I say. Now, Jesus went into Capernaum, and he was in Capernaum, and Matthew chapter 8 tells us how he had healed Peter's wife's mother, who was ill with a fever. Jesus was, I think he was staying in Peter's house. If he wasn't, he was certainly in Capernaum anyway. He was at Peter's mother's house, and he healed Peter's mother. Peter's wife's mother, I should say. And then it says, at evening, everyone gathered at the door, brought their sick and lame to be healed. No reasons given in Matthew's text as to why it was then, but not before. And you might be puzzled. You think, well, if you'd been in that position, wouldn't you have brought your child or your spouse or your father or whatever who you wanted to be healed, and you couldn't get healing any other way, brought him to Jesus? But it was only at evening. Now, it's not until you read the parallel accounts in the other Gospels that you can deduce why this was so. Matthew doesn't tell you. He just simply tells you the facts. He's just reporting what happened, so he says. Okay, and we're judging whether he's telling the truth. When, as I said, in Matthew's Gospel even, and elsewhere, crowds had come to Jesus for healing. Now, when we turn to Mark's account, in Mark 21, and we find that it's a parallel account of the same incident, that Jesus is healing Peter's wife's mother, we find it was the Sabbath day. Now, remember, in Jewish reckoning, that the day begins at sunset and continues through to sunset of the following day. So, in terms of our timing, the Sabbath starts Friday at sunset, goes to Saturday at sunset. So Jesus had been in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. He'd taught there. He'd come home. He'd come back to Peter's house. He'd healed Peter's wife's mother in the house. And then at evening, the people all gathered around his house. But in Matthew, it doesn't tell you it's the Sabbath. It didn't actually mention that he'd been at the synagogue. It just simply records those facts. Mark, we learn it was the Sabbath. Now, even so, you might wonder, well, why would they wait to be healed? Well, when you look at other passages, Matthew included, and Luke, and elsewhere, you find there was a great controversy about the Sabbath. Now, I actually think Jesus deliberately provoked some of that controversy to demonstrate he had the right, not more than the right. It was right that he heal on the Sabbath. So he created this controversy with the Pharisees, and that was one of the reasons why the religious leaders were opposed to Jesus, because he didn't observe their traditions and what they thought the law says that you shouldn't do these things on the Sabbath, and therefore he was disrespecting God in their view. So Jesus actually provoked that. I'm sure that was the case, but you find that out from other passages that the Jews said very strongly. The Jewish religious leaders said to the people, don't come and be healed on the Sabbath, because that would be work and you mustn't work on the Sabbath day. And the people generally were in awe of the Pharisees. They were the people, they looked up to the Pharisees for their teaching and everything. So right or wrong, don't consider the rights or wrongs of that. That's how the people behaved. They generally followed the Pharisees and didn't want to unnecessarily provoke these esteemed religious leaders, so they didn't come on the Sabbath to have the healings that they so desperately wanted. They came that evening at the end of the Sabbath, and so the Sabbath's just over, then they gather at the door. You see how all that makes sense? It all fits together and makes sense, but it's not actually explained in Matthew. Matthew is not there, he's not trying to explain to you, hey, this happened because of such and such and such and such. He doesn't do that. He just says, they came, Jesus did this, and then he did that, and at even time they all came. So he's just reporting the facts, and it's only by adding together pieces from elsewhere that are not necessarily about that, not there to explain it, but they actually do explain it. This is just the kind of thing I'm talking about, the significance of an undesigned coincidence. Okay, now moving on. So there's the quotes about it that give the background to that. You can look at that at your leisure. Now another matter was about Herod talking to his servants. John the Baptist confronted Herod, said that he shouldn't be married to this woman who was actually his brother's wife. Once again, let's not get into the issue, but John antagonised Herod and Herod's wife, who was intent on having him killed. John actually did get him killed reluctantly, because he thought he was a prophet, but he had him beheaded. Remember how his head was brought on a platter, and so on, when the daughter Salome did this magnificent dance and everything. So anyway, Herod was, when he suddenly heard after this, he had all this interaction with John the Baptist, unpleasant interaction, and he didn't want to put him to death, but he was he had his arm twisted into putting him to death. And when he heard about Jesus and all the miracles going on, he heard all these reports, he thought, uh-oh, this is John the Baptist come back to life, and I'm in for it. That's what he thought. And he wanted to get to see this Jesus. And how is he going to do this? Where's this Jesus and everything? And it says in the record that it tells you this about Herod. He talked to his servants about this, about his desire to see Jesus, thinking that he might be John the Baptist in his superstitious way of thinking. Now it's only elsewhere, even there, it tells us in Matthew 14 that Herod he heard about Jesus and he talked to his servants. It's only elsewhere that we heard that Herod was keen to meet Jesus. That adds together with a record in another place, in another parallel gospel. And elsewhere, completely unrelated to this incident, we learn that Herod's servants included Christians, some quite devout Christians. You have to actually look in Luke's gospel for that, Luke chapter 8, and also in Acts chapter 13 you find that there were two servants. Now let me just quickly go through this. That's the text in Matthew. Here is Herod saying, this is recorded in Luke, Herod says, I beheaded John. Who then is this I hear such things about? He tried to see Jesus. This is where we learn that he wanted to see Jesus. And then, completely divorced from this, it's nothing to do with the execution of John the Baptist or Herod, what's going on in Herod's court or anything. Luke tells us who it was that was travelling around with Jesus. Jesus was going around Galilee and he had his disciples with him, and it tells us that there were some women with him as well. And it says how some of them were wealthy, and they actually provided for Jesus and the disciples out of their means, it says, meaning that they had the means to provide for them. And one of them was Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, and many others. So here's a woman who is the wife of a significant person. You know, Herod's, what would you call him? Like a chief butler or something. He wasn't in charge of the military or anything like that. Herod was a very powerful, despotic figure, much hated by all the people. But so it wasn't them, but this Joanna was there. And there were many others. And then later on in Acts 2, we learn one more thing. In the church at Antioch, this is years later, there were prophets and teachers. One of them that happens to be named was Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. That doesn't actually tell you that he was there in Herod's household, but it does give a pretty close link with Herod all the same. And this could be an explanation as to, well, how did the writer know what Herod was talking to his servants? Well, it happened that some servants there were very keen followers of Jesus and may well have easily been the ones who passed the information on to Luke. I know, the Holy Spirit inspired the writers, I believe that, but I also believe there were human sources for things too. And so that Luke, in writing his account, could easily have got this information from this Joanna and Chuza, and maybe Manaen as well. It makes sense. It fits together. It's not 100% watertight, but it makes sense. These things fit together. It explains how the writer of the Gospel would know what Herod was doing in his own private time and place. And it also explains why he would be wanting to talk with them about how to find this Jesus and what Jesus is about. Because this Joanna was obviously a very serious follower of Jesus, and probably therefore her husband was too. Okay, so that too is what I'd call an undesigned coincidence. Now the third one is about Peter disowning Christ and being recognised by a woman there. And this third one is about how Peter gained access into the place where Jesus was tried. That there were actually, so another gospel tells us there was a girl, a woman at the gate who had control of the gate into this house, into this place where Jesus was tried, which was really the house of the high priest, a very grand house, no doubt. And he was let in because John the Apostle was inside, known to the household, and he asked the lady to let Peter in. Peter otherwise wouldn't have access. And then when he was in there, it tells how he denied Jesus 3 times. And it says how he was recognised by a woman. And she said, weren't you with Jesus? Aren't you one of his? And so all 3 occasions did things like this. I won't go into that further, but it's just that when you read John's Gospel, you find that there was actually a girl on duty at the door whom John spoke to, who would have then, you imagine, looked Peter over before letting him in. Then it registered with her that, well, she thinks he fits in with this Jesus, and so later on she says to others, this fellow was with them too. And that led to the occasion of Peter giving one of the denials of Christ. Look, I won't elaborate that further because we've run out of time. There's the relevant quotes about that. But once again, the way this fits together needs more than one place. It's not only one place. You read one place, you get certain facts given. You read another place, and you get other facts that kind of explain or make it believable, make it understandable what the first writer has written. If you only had the first writer, you think, well, how come Peter got in there, How come he was recognised by this woman? Well, it sort of fits together. Once again, nothing's watertight, but it's plausible, it makes sense. And this thing is a cumulative argument. And when you get 100 of such things, you think, well, heck, the record is pretty reliable. That's the point. Each of these undesigned coincidences are marks of truth, indications that the writers are telling the unadorned truth. They're just recording what they saw, what they experienced. And what this means then, if we, the few I've shown you, and many others that I can't, they tell us that what's being written about here, it's not a fiction, they're real people. They're real people. These things really happen to them. They're real events that are being recorded. Quite often, miracles involved, not always, but quite often there's miracle involved. And when a miracle is intimately involved with these recorded events, it means, hell, one way or another, that miracle must have happened. So I might think it's pretty implausible, pretty unreasonable that such a miracle happened, but the testimony of the writers is found to be reliable and consistent. And all this tells me, and should tell you, that we can have confidence in the Bible. I actually have a very high view of the Bible record and and believe that I understand there are problems. There are definitely issues with understanding what was meant and by the original writers. What does it mean for us today? Things like that. They're definitely, it's not just all cut and dried, but overall we can have great confidence in the Bible that it is what it purports to be, the Word of God, that it is reliable, it's trustworthy, and we can have confidence in it, and therefore it's authoritative. So when it says God said this, and God said that, and He commands you this and commands me that, I better take notice. So that's where we get to. My plea for you all, and to me too, is that we should read the Bible because it really is the Word of God. Thank you, folks.
Thanks very much for the presentation, Geoff. It's a subject that I'm quite keen on. Geoff introduced it to me, and I think there's a fair bit in it. But I'll start off as the devil's advocate. All right. You mentioned that there are 131 instances that were mentioned by Blunt.
Yeah.
Could that? We've had some cherries tonight. Could that just be cherry picking? Like, can those coincidences occur by accident and people just go over and find out the ones, but really they just occurred by chance?
Well, it's really like in a court of law. You're listening to testimony of witnesses to an event or an alleged event, and looking for consistency and inconsistencies in their testimony, both consistency within one testimony and how that relates to another one's, and whether it meshes or not. And I think it's the same kind of thing. You could perhaps say the same about a court of law. These principles work in the justice system. That's how we work in our human way to establish the reliability of witnesses. Someone fronting up, they might be doctor this or professor that. They might have fine appearance or whatever, but you've actually got to listen to their testimony and really weigh things up very carefully. And I think that's what Blunt has done. And others in these things. I've been very impressed with some of the work I've read already in Paley, comparing the letters of Paul with the Acts. And if I'd had time, I would like to have brought one of those forward, perhaps the first one in this book actually, to do with how Paul collected money for the saints back in Jerusalem from people in Achaia and Macedonia, and movements, his movements over there. I can't go into all the detail of that, it needs quite some explanation. But again, it meshes so very well without there being any obvious collusion between the writer of Acts and the writer of the letters of Paul. One way or the other, they seem independent. I can only say that it speaks to me. This subject really does speak to me. It's not the only thing that I rely on to think that this is what I read in the Bible is the Word of God. Wouldn't even say it's the prime thing. But all these things add together. I think there is a witness to do with archaeology and historical testimony. I know that everything you look at, one expert say this thing, another expert say something else. So I do believe, finally, that the testimony that this is the Word of God and it is God speaking and it's authoritative is in my heart. Now, I know that sounds really weak. It sounds, I just have this feeling, And people have feelings about all sorts of things. I feel this, I feel that, and this is the current age, isn't it? This is the age of feelings. But finally, I actually do believe that, and it's not just on the basis of today I just drunk something, or I feel this must be it, this must be right. It's not like that at all. It's something that's very deep and very long-standing. It's consistent. It takes me through all manner of things: high times, low times, times I'm alone, times with other people, things I hear. It all adds together and has what one writer called a ring of truth. It's hard to pinpoint. You can't say, well, I believe it's the truth because of this one thing or that one thing. But the whole thing has a ring of truth. It actually speaks to the human condition, speaks to my experience of life, in its highs and lows and its ups and downs. And this is one aspect of it. Now, I know any one instance you look at in this, you're quite entitled to think, I don't really think much of that. It's not that it knocks the case out. You can discard that one. You go and you have a look at the next one, and you look at the next one and so on, because it is a cumulative case. If you had three, I think, that's pretty impressive. 3 coincidences that all makes sense. Those 3. But then it adds, you've got 4, 5, 6, 10, 20, 30. Finally you come to think, heck, this must be what it says it is, the Word of God. That's how I think.
Yeah. To me, it's primarily talks about the historical events that occurred.
Yeah, that's true.
And the going to say it's the Word of God is an additional step dependent on other things.
But that's what it says of itself. So it says that of itself. So,
yes.
And that how can I put this? And you've got so many miracles wrapped up with these things. If you can see, there's consistency in that story, that core David environment. You might not like the fact that God judges these people in this way, and that He also disposes of their descendants. That's a thing to be discussed and debated. Not debated, but certainly discussed. It is an issue. I appreciate that. But if you come to the conclusion that this whole event, the things around it, actually make it seem that this is true testimony and that really happened, heck, the earth really did open up and swallow up these people. Gee, I better take note of what God says, because that's what it says. It says that God said He would do this, and then He did it, and the people reacted in such a way. Maybe that really is history, and maybe He would do that again.
Right, I've had my bit. Yeah.
I've become quite passionate about this subject.
I thought I was going to do a devil's advocate one, and I think, how many inconsistencies are there? Has anybody done a study on that?
Well, many people have written books about the alleged inconsistencies in the Bible, and all the ones I've ever looked at, generally they don't hold water.
Yeah,
generally,
so that's from a Christian perspective. I'm saying, how many inconsistencies are there? I mean, you don't know. That's what. What I'm really trying to imply is there are inconsistencies which you can maybe in your mind write off because you're convinced of the truth, rather than because the inconsistencies...
there are still things that are not explained.
There would be inconsistencies that would not necessarily outweigh, but then it is a matter of faith. You just said it yourself. It's a matter of faith that you accept the consistencies and rejected the inconsistencies.
No, I don't reject the inconsistencies. I
Or
don't
you
believe
rationalise them or something.
I don't believe there are genuine inconsistencies there.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. That's rationalising.
People point them out.
That's rationalising them in my mind.
No, it's not. It's because they can be considered. People's arguments about alleged inconsistencies can be considered and weighed up and found to be wanting. That there is actually no inconsistency there. Very often there are additional facts that come to light or further analysis of the record. I actually believe in analysing the record, and you find that, well, what you thought was an inconsistency is actually consistent. Now, this is a very powerful testimony to the truth, where there is an alleged inconsistency, an apparent inconsistency that is later resolved by the discovery of another fact about it, or something else comes into it, and when you add that in, it explains the apparent inconsistency. I think that is a very powerful witness to the truth. And in my experience, and I have read pretty widely on these things, and I believe others will have too, what are purported to be inconsistencies very often are resolved, and I do admit that there are some which are not resolved, but on the basis that so many have been resolved, I have confidence that the remaining ones, eventually, if we only knew more facts, they would be resolved. So I find this with many things. This is why I have spoken about the resurrection appearances of Jesus that are allegedly inconsistent, but when you analyse them, as the writer I referred to, John Wenham, does in his book, they actually are consistent. Actually, there's no final inconsistency there, in my view. I've read his book. It's not just that I accept it on faith, as though, your faith's opposed to reason. By faith, I think, well, it must be right. No, by careful analysis of the record and analysing everything, as Wenham does in his book, I think that those alleged inconsistencies are resolved in that case. Now, I'm not saying there aren't others that are not yet resolved, but my experience is that of past ones being resolved, that I've got confidence that future ones will be too.
Just a comment, being a devil's advocate to get to you. There's the accusation of rationalising. As soon as somebody actually tries to provide an explanation, you say, "Oh, you're just rationalising," and so that can be used to answer any question.
Yeah, but see, I mean, my question was more broad than that. It says, have you actually? You've claimed you've done that, but I haven't been to a talk where the reverse has happened, and the inconsistencies have been counted.
You can find many books on the subject.
I think
that's what I'm saying. And I'm certain that the people who want to take the other view would take the opposite of what you've got. And I've got no opinion. That's what I'm saying. I'm just trying to ask an honest question.
Well, something Geoff said in his talk, which I found interesting as well, is that even with apparent inconsistencies, it might not necessarily be them. It's actually a good thing. So, like he was saying, in a court of law, if you've got too many people saying the exact same story, then you've got issues of collusion or copying or these sorts of things. And so what you've got in the New Testament is 27 books from 9 different authors. And I can also promise you I've never come across any witness in court of law that was willing to die for what they wrote in their testimonies. So that sort of adds another layer to it for me. The other thing is that if two people see an event, the same event, they almost always focus on different things. It's a little bit like a movie. When you watch a movie, you sort of say, "Oh, do you remember that bit in the background, or that thing happening?" And then the person next to you goes, "No, I got this out of it." And it's sort of, but the sort of key thing of the story actually ties together. And I think, things like Jesus saying who he said he was, his death and resurrection certainly come through all 27 books of the New Testament, and so there isn't really contradictions about the very big aspects and the core tenets of Christianity, and there's quite early unity in the faith around those sort of core things. And Paul writes, he says, look, if Jesus didn't rise again, then this whole thing is pointless. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents on it.
Yes, I know
Yeah.
more about the Old Testament than the New Testament.
Old
Where I
Testament.
think, there's many incidences of where history is written by the victors, if you like, and so therefore there's a slant put on it by the people writing. I think because they're writing it for their own perspective.
Yeah, and
that's true. You know, Roman history, even our history with the colonisation. etc.
yeah, and that's where the Bible actually does stand apart a little bit, because you've got this thing called the doctrine of embarrassment, where all throughout the New Testament, the disciples are kind of put down, and they're the idiots, and Peter's called Satan, and they just don't get it, and all these sorts of things. But they actually record these and they write them down, and so if they're writing something that's embarrassing to them, it's kind of more likely to be true. Exactly what you're saying.
I'm not arguing with that at all.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I do accept that, but.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
What I was really trying to say is
Yeah.
I don't find those arguments that you just put very convincing. Okay, that's why there will be always disagreement on it.
Yeah, but even through the Old Testament, there's quite a few situations like that. Like Jonah is one of the very sort of oldest books of the Old Testament, and he spent the whole time defying what he was told to do, and he's always doing the wrong thing, and he's always whinging, and he wants to die because he doesn't want to do what God told him to do. And then even in the Pentateuch, the sort of 5 books of Moses, there's constant rebellion, constant stupidity, constant turning away, constant, whinging, and it doesn't paint a very good picture of the people who are actually part of it and who wrote it. I find it interesting. Whereas if you look at the sort of records about Alexander the Great, it's all about how he did this manoeuvre and how he did well here and how he,
They're put on a pedestal.
Well, yeah,
what you're saying about Jonah too, resisting God, lies to Moses in the first place.
Yeah.
And virtually all of the leaders of the Old Testament below that,
he admits to murder, doesn't he?
Pardon?
He admits to murdering somebody.
Yeah, but they don't want to do what God has called them to do.
No, that's right.
And all the prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, others too, they resist God. So it doesn't paint them in a very good light.
No.
And concerning the people of God, if this is a Jewish book, justifying the Jewish point of view, it puts the Jews in a very bad light.
Well, not necessarily. It shows that God will punish you if you disobey Him. I think that's what the main story.
Yeah, that's why Jerusalem was sacked and why it was such a.
Well, that's right. So therefore, it's actually an example of what you do if you disobey God. That's what I read the Old Testament's about. I mean, and there are some brilliant books that are unusual books in there as well that show that it's more than just a story of the Jews. There's the Song of Solomon and those
and it's interesting.
Books that people don't like in there, but they're in there.
That's right. But the funny thing about going back to Jonah again is that Jonah was indignant because he says, God, you're just too loving, you're too merciful, you're too wonderful, and I hate these people. And so that's why he was upset, because it's funny because people sort of say, the God of the Old Testament scares me and the God of the New Testament is all like peaches and cream.
Yeah.
I actually look at it the complete opposite. I sort of think, it's just sort of mercy upon mercy upon mercy, warning upon warning upon warning in the Old Testament. And then you've got Jesus talking about, sudden judgment and weeping and gnashing of teeth and hell and all this sort of stuff. Jesus is the one that scares me. The Old Testament God doesn't as much. So it's sort of interesting. It just depends on how you come at it, I guess.
I think the story of Jonah is unusual in the context of the Old Testament.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Because it's all about retribution, the second generations and all that sort of stuff. Yet that was one where it's actually somebody saying something different, or there's a different story there.
It's quite something you said earlier.
It is quite different.
The victor writes the history. History is written by the victor. And looking through all of the stories from ancient times.
I didn't say the victor, I said by the person that's interested. I said use the victor, but what I really meant was by the person who's the story's about.
In ancient times, so you read all the histories and they all praise up the big things. When something bad happens, it gets hardly a mention. And so you've got to read it from someone else's perspective to get that. Read through the Old Testament, it gives the good and the bad.
Yeah.
And one interesting exercise is to compare Kings and Chronicles, which cover basically the same period. And Chronicles is written from a more political perspective, as in the normal way things are done, and has a lot less of the negative. compared to Kings, which shows up the negatives. And you can just compare the way things...
Oh, I mean, that's the strength of the Bible, is that there's that tension there. I agree with that. But that's what I'm trying to say. I don't necessarily disagree with that part of it, but I disagree with your taking that further. Or sorry, I question it. Okay, I don't find the argument convincing.
Okay.
You think he's taking his conclusions?
It wouldn't convince me, to be a Christian or believe in the Bible. Just that argument alone.
But yeah, well, maybe not. But like the point Geoff made is it's a cumulative case. When you do look through 130 of them instead of 4 or 5, that it starts to make a bit of sense.
I didn't want to keep you longer than I did usually.
Oh, that's right. No, it's not that.
Yeah.
I find the Bethuel one quite interesting. I find that one about Bethuel, like it is unusual to have this guy sitting, who should be significant, sitting in the background and the role taken up by his son.
Maybe he was decrepit, sick, or...
It's
not explained.
Plausible reasons for it, I agree.
Yeah, there was clearly a reason.
Yeah, but it's not
There's
stated.
clearly a reason if it actually happened. If it was made up, then there's no good reason for it.
Yeah, that was the point, yes.
Why make the story up with that in there? You just wouldn't bother.
Yeah, I find that one very interesting, that story. I particularly like it because it's so early in the Bible record, back in the era when, back at the time, people say, oh, this is all just myth, and Abraham didn't exist and all these patriarchal characters. Well, there's actual reason to believe that they did.
But then, that's not, to me, I'll just expand what you're trying to say, is that there are books, there are other books, old history books and things like that have elements of truth in them too.
Yeah.
There'll be a bit of the story, and then there's a bit that you don't believe because it's mythical. But there are evidence, there are factual bits in the book as well.
How did the writer know what you were going to be able to test and what you weren't?
Well, at that time it was what they believed, or perhaps, or whatever. But I'm just saying it's not unique to the Bible, what you just...
other people may have written true histories.
Oh, sorry, there's elements where there is non-factual bits and there's elements which are truth. And if you pick it out, you can pick the bits that are factual.
So do you believe Romulus and Remus were raised by a wolf?
No, I don't.
As an example.
But yes, exactly right. But then Rome did certainly rise to power.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Actually, there's another undesigned
it
coincidence.
was probably those brothers as well. Okay.
There's another coincidence which I'll just bring your attention in relation to that same incident with Bethuel and co. And that is that that period, Jacob married 2 sisters who were his cousins, Uncle Laban's daughters. Abraham too, 2 generations earlier, he married Sarai. His name was Abram. He married Sarai. The names have changed. Who was his maybe half sister or maybe cousin, something certainly close relation in his same generation. This character here, Jacob, he's going, Isaac, the one they're trying to find a wife for, who he marries is somebody from his wider family who's actually 1 generation removed. She's a cousin, but once removed. And this is not brought out in the text. You have to search around and find that. Yeah, well, when you trace back, you find out it's a generation different. Why was it a generation different? Why didn't he marry his cousin like Jacob married his two female cousins, tricked into marrying them both? Well, that marries together with another story that Isaac was born out of due time. He was born to Abraham and Sarah, who was past bearing children miraculously. And so therefore he was much younger and on a par with this Rebecca of another generation. So once again, the record doesn't explain all that, but it's just the marrying together. Here's a fact about, here's an alleged fact about what's happened here. Here's another one, and they just mesh. And that's what you expect of true testimony.
And Isaac didn't marry until he was about 60 or 70 years old too. I've checked it once. He was pretty old when he did get married to Rebecca.
Oh, I think it was earlier than that. He married after his mother's death, and he was comforted after his mother's death by marrying Rebecca. I thought he was about 40 actually, but he was older, a bit older. Yeah. Another thing too.
He lived to 180, you know, and
Yeah, they lived a long time.
and
This is another subject, the age of the patriarchs, which I hope I might bring forward one day. There's another coincidence too there. Sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. I can go on. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on that Romulus and Remus thing again. I don't know too many people who are willing to die for that story. They're like, okay, it's fine. It's in the record books, but I'm not going to lay down my life for the truth of it.
That's right.
But there was plenty of the original writers and those soon after who were happy to lay down their lives for the truth of the
Oh, you
death
said
and
for the
resurrection.
truth,
So it's
but I don't
it's just an interesting difference.
But I wouldn't die for the story of Jonah.
Not alone.
No.
Not on that alone.
No,
So,
yeah.
so that's the
Yeah.
somebody going in a whale and whatever.
Yeah, but
I would die for
Jesus sort of attested to the Old Testament as well, and he quoted from the Septuagint, and
It all hangs together.
It all sort of hangs together, but I just think that's an interesting distinction that a lot of us Greeks love Alexander the Great, but I'm not dying for the fact that he won the Battle of Gaugamela. Quite frankly, I think he did, but I don't care. I don't care enough to die for it. It's a bit of a difference, I guess.
something you mentioned about, which you might find a bit interesting that I've checked into, is, we all understand that Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees,
Yeah.
which is somewhere near Babylon,
Yeah.
because there is a place called Ur out that way, and Chaldees just means believers in foreign gods. But if I spent a fair bit of time in the Middle East, and I've been to a place called Shanlurtha, and the locals just call it Urfa, and it's about 3 million people. It's in southern Turkey, about 70 or 80 miles from the border of Syria, and I'm convinced that Abraham's extended family came from that area. The locals, the 3 million people, they certainly all believe it. They've got Abraham's pool and Abraham's fish and various things about Abraham in their tourist type places. And certainly there's a place about 50 miles south of that called Haran, which was the name of Abraham's brother, I think it was. No, Abraham's father's brother, Terah's brother, was named Haran. And everyone seems to agree that is the place where Abraham's father died. Remember that they started off, and then because he was involved with foreign gods, it said he had some foreign gods or some gods with him, which are these little garden gnome type things that they carved around with them. And he wasn't ever really supposed to go. God called Abraham and his immediate family, and so the father wanted to go along as well. And so God appears probably kept him out of there by getting him sick in Iran, and he died soon afterwards. And they carried on into Israel, went to Canaan. And so yes, it's more than likely that Urfa, which is very close to Ur, was also, they were Chaldeans as well, believers in multiple gods, and so and it's probable that those gods finished, because Abraham didn't want to take them into the land, finished up with Laban eventually, and that of course Rachel stole them and took them into the land anyway eventually. And as you may recall, that when she died at Bethlehem, she was buried under a terebinth tree, and they were buried with her or something. So they finished up.
The gods were buried with her.
Eh?
The gods were buried with her. Her little
Yeah. That when she died, those
Well, disposed of the gods.
from-
It's possible. I was just going to say, in relation to that, all those peoples believed in other gods and multiple gods and everything. It's possible that those gods that Laban had and everything were also kind of boundary marks, kind of title deeds. So I understand from archaeological testimony. It's not to say they weren't worshipped as gods and so on. But it's ironic that when Laban came searching for these gods, which he accused Jacob of stealing, and that his wife Rachel had unknowing to Jacob hidden in the pack that she was seeing, she said, look, excuse me, lady, I can't get up. The manner of women is upon me. I don't know whether that means she was pregnant or whether she was menstruating, whatever. But anyway, she said she couldn't get up, would she'd be excused, and that they were hidden underneath her.
Yeah.
And so Laban accepted that, and he searched everywhere else, couldn't find these jolly things. And then Jacob has this, very argumentative interchange with him and so on. She ends up dying in childbirth.
Yeah.
It's a bit ironic, to say the least, that she's done this, she's engaged in this sin of stealing God's, claiming the way of women as being why she shouldn't have the thing underneath her searched. And then she dies in childbirth with, who was it, with Benjamin, that's right. Son of my sorrow he was going to be, and then he became son of my right hand. Yeah, so it's, the stories are really, they're wonderful stories actually. The way they all hang together and all the nuances in them, they're beautifully told stories actually. At the very least, quite apart from their truth. And later on this year, I hope I'll give a talk on the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 20. Did I say this year? Next year, sorry. Yeah, I think we've had it for this year. Next year. And that too, the storytelling there is really phenomenal. It's quite apart from anything else. Anyway, that's an aside.
I've got a slightly less biblical thing, but you were talking about the little idols being like a title deed or proof of ancestral land ownership. And what came to my mind is there's some people groups up in the north of Northern Territory use painted poles as their title deeds to the lands.
Yeah.
And apparently when they were negotiating with the federal government about that ancestral ownership, they were asked, do you have any documents? And they said, well, here's our documents. And they were these painted poles. You see them in some museums.
Yeah.
And presumably the symbols on the poles, tell a story in their typology. But it just sort of reminded me of this, that they regarded and they don't think they worship them in what we would regard as bowing to them or anything like that. But these objects, were to them the title deeds.
A lot of things from way, way back in the biblical setting are not clear, but archaeologists and others are finding out more and more as time goes on, and we can get a clearer picture of what things might actually mean, how they lived, and things like that. Yes. And they don't actually prove anything, but they just add to the overall background to the Bible story.
Yes.
In like the relationships, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and they married close relatives.
Yeah.
And that later became taboo, didn't it?
Yeah. I don't know about cousins, whether cousins were allowed or not. But anyway, there was the issue of consanguinity.
We wouldn't allow some of that today.
It's not a good idea, that's for sure.
No, seriously.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if that was a characteristic of 2000 BC, and then later, was it a common thing?
It still is.
Yeah, in Eastern cultures it still is.
And in some Aboriginal cultures too, there's certain uncles descendant that you're supposed to marry. It's done on genealogy terms.
Yeah, but those uncles are not necessarily related.
No,
everybody's an uncle.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But they're still related.
It's a tribal system that they
not.
have because they've had Group A, Group B, and Group C, and then they're told which group they're allowed to choose their partner from.
Skin groups, aren't they?
Australian Aboriginal marriage laws are very complex, actually.
Yeah. I know Wikipedia is not the gospel, but if you go into Wikipedia and look up cousin marriage, you find that it's the favoured form of marriage in a lot of current existing cultures now.
Yeah, there's a medical journal just released about inter-family marriage in England amongst the Pakistani population and how there's some genetic issues. And yeah, it was just released last year actually.
But I mean, in terms of rulers,
that still happens.
Yeah, in terms of rulers, it was a way of keeping the rule within the family.
Yeah.
Okay, so the classic one in the modern sense is the not Victoria, but not Victorians, but the Habsburgs.
Yeah, but it seems to me that marrying close relatives is more characteristic of the Abrahamic period, and then taboos later on. So it would there's kind of a dissonance there between one era and the other.
Of course, if you believe the biblical record, back in Adam's day, brother must have married sister. Yeah. But
they were created perfect, weren't they? My understanding is that with every generation there's an average of 200 more errors in the gene sequences, so you're much more likely to finish up with deformed children now that we're about 50 generations later than Adam or whatever it is. And so, you know, there's going to be a lot more deformities, and lots of people like the Sumerians have a terrible amount of deformities because they're so intermarried. And, you know, every generation we're getting more and more miscarriages and, you know...
So it's more of a problem now than what it would have been.
That's right. Right back at the beginning, it would have been a very... the gene pool would have been very diverse, you know. I don't understand all these things. You should tell us about this.
I'll tell you more about it. So, hey, I could do a talk on that. But I've actually wrote up an article for another group that I'm involved with to try to explain. As far as I know, again looking at things like Wikipedia, I think the Anglican Church in England will still marry first cousins, and it's not very dangerous to do it one generation. It's when you do it generation after generation after generation, because the choice of genes that the child might end up with gets so narrow. Normally I've got 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, etc. Because none of those people were related to each other particularly closely. But if they were all cousins, you end up and you've only got 20 great-great-great-great-great-grandparents. You know, instead of having hundreds of whatever, how many greats they have. And that's when it gets dangerous, because you're so likely to double up on one of these genes that's bad for you.
That's right.
But so it's doing it once, to go back to that, doing it once isn't too terrible. It's when you just keep doing it generation after generation.
So that's a joke about hillbillies or Tasmanians or whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, it's still legal under Australian law.
But you know,
because again, it's not dangerous doing it once.
but the other interesting
But some
thing
relationships aren't.
But
Uncle and that is not cousins. Some are, some aren't. It's weird.
But the
just
interesting
the power
thing,
difference, I suppose, between the older relative. You know what I mean?
Well,
like the person you've got to look up to.
I'm not sure. I guess between an uncle and a niece, for example, there might be less difference than, say, 2 cousins. I don't know, because you're introducing another person into it. It's in Australian law. You can.
There's an F factor. I went on to the genetics back in my youth. That you actually can calculate the F factor, which is like an inbreeding coefficient, and it sort of boils down to the risk of doubling up on a bad gene.
Well, interestingly, with the patriarchal period, I've mentioned how closely they relate. You know, over successive generations they married. There was quite a bit of infertility, which, you know, I could believe is in God's purpose, but Sarah couldn't bear, and then down, Rachel couldn't bear. Sorry, Rebecca could. She had twins, didn't she?
Yeah.
Didn't they have to Isaac had to pray for her?
Yeah, I think he did. That's right.
Yeah.
And then the next generation, Rachel couldn't bear either, and that her sister was very fertile, and that was a great source of contention between the two. But yeah, there was a bit of infertility back there.
As is now.
For different reasons.
Anyway.